You're watching As It Happens, and tonight, Cathy Mohlalana, I'm standing in for Vuyomvoko. Well, we've been talking to the EFF's Floyd Shivambu, of course, about his comments in Parliament. Let's get some analysis now. In studio with me is diversity expert Terry Oakley Smith, and on the line, joining us from our Durban studio is going to be the Sociology Professor Ashwin Desai. And Ashwin, I'll come to you in a moment, but Terry, let me begin with you in studio, and let's perhaps talk about this notion of who is African, who is un-African. The EFF chief were speaking earlier, saying that, you know, we get these forms that we have. He referenced a home affairs form. Now, I haven't seen a home affairs form to see what exactly the racial categorization there is. But the point is saying, if you're ticking any other box that does not necessarily say black or does not say African, then you don't fall under being African.
You know, I think there's been a lot of confusion for some time around this particular categorization. I think if one looks at the EE Act and broad-based black economic empowerment, it makes it very clear. There is a category called black, which is an umbrella term for Africans, coloureds and South Africans of Indian descent. So what Floyd was highlighting was that there would have been a different categorization for him, for example, as a person of African descent, and an Indian person of an Indian person such as the person we're discussing earlier.
And of course, this language is very important because it really comes down to race and how we understand each other's race and Africanness, especially in the context of our history and where we come from. And having conversations like this where someone, maybe not overtly, but is hinted at being un-African.
Well, I think that, you know, if you look at it from a broad categorization perspective, I think that, you know, I have to agree with Floyd. I mean, Floyd is talking about the categories that are there in the EE Act. It isn't to say that Momoniat has not played a significant role in the struggle, has not done magnificent work in his position. But I think the point that Floyd is making is that, you know, Africans make up the vast majority of the population, Cathy. And even if we look at recent statistics on employment equity, we see that South Africans of Indian descent are really overrepresented, particularly in the finance sector. And I think that could be where this debate is springing from. I think it also highlights issues to do with how uncertain we are as South Africans around issues of race. There was such almost a rush from the media to point this out as a racial incident, whereas if they'd listened carefully, and I listened several times today to the discussion, Floyd was merely questioning, actually, you know, how come when 80% of the people who work in National Treasury are African, how come Africans are not represented fully? How come there is always one person who is a black person but of Indian descent who appears to be the main spokesperson on all issues? So, I mean, he raised that in quite a sort of modest tone. And for some reason, it's obviously struck a hot button.
All right. Let me bring in a sociology professor, Ashwin Desai, into this conversation. Ashwin, you also heard part of that conversation with Floyd Shivambu. Do you think that we are being bogged down by the semantics of language and perhaps are being oversensitive to the broader issue that Floyd Shivambu is trying to raise?
Not at all. Not at all. I think that despite what the last person has said, that when I read it, I mean, I'm totally disgusted because, firstly, Floyd is undermining African leadership. Ismail's boss, Dondo, says, you go and represent me. I want you to go there. Ismail goes to represent the Treasury on behalf of his boss, who happens to be African. Now, Floyd comes along and says that by Ismail being there, he's undermining African leadership. It's really Orwellian. He just doesn't know what he's doing. He doesn't know what he's saying. And no matter what verbal gymnastics he uses, even the EFF statement that follows it picks on a particular individual. He says that Ismail Momoniat undermines African people and validates Indians, coloreds and whites. Now, for your diversity expert there, if that is not essentializing race and is racist, then I have no idea what is racist. Number two, on this question of a form, that is complete nonsense. That is a law of the land that says you have to tick a particular category. That is not saying whenever I have a category, I choose not to tick African, but I choose Indian. So this contest is a very serious contest, simply because my argument would be that this EFF has been involved in undermining African leadership, and often rightly so. So, for example, if I oppose Mbeki's denialism, Zuma's corruption, Ramaphosa being a billionaire, am I anti-African leadership? The EFF will say, oh, look at this Indian guy. He's undermining African leadership. But just let me read you the EFF manifesto. It says this: the post-1994 government has maintained the apartheid and white supremacist state. The Mandela government, the Mbeki government, the Zuma government, the Motlanthe government has maintained the white supremacist state. So they can argue that of the ANC and not be seen to undermine African leadership. But if somebody is representing the Treasury with their boss's consent, who happens to be African, they somehow are involved in undermining African leadership. Rubbish, rubbish, rubbish.
Do you think that, Ashwin, that this conversation and how it also took place in Parliament also brings to question the claim that people of Indian descent have to Africanness, because it certainly seems like that is part of the subliminal nuance that's there, that something is being taken away from people of Indian descent.
I think in a lot of ways. I mean, I think, we're living with a colonial and apartheid legacy. Overnight, we're not going to be something else. But for somebody like Floyd Shivambu to come and use apartheid categories and validate apartheid categories, I think is quite crazy. But I think you're absolutely right. The way the media have handled this, the way parliamentarians have handled this, and other commentators have handled this, have just indicated the poverty of thinking around race on this issue. I'll give you an example. That in the Daily Maverick, I mean, it's just complete nonsense that has been written about saying, one was saying, oh, he's got great apartheid credentials, Ismail Momoniat. Well, that's, for me, not a defense. Then they go on to say, okay, we can't use that as a defense, but actually he's a maths wizard. Now, how is that a defense? A maths wizard dealing with what is actually social relations of change in South Africa. So we have this. Then Professor Farid Issa from the University of Johannesburg, my colleague, says, oh, Ismail keeps quiet in the background because he respects African leadership. So you can see how this racial narrative enters in many ways, and we don't come to grips with it. Now, Floyd Shivambu, in his letter, for example, goes on. He then writes to Yunus Karim saying, Ismail Momoniat, maybe you went to the World Bank in New York with him, and so on. This is the level of debate of one of the preeminent political parties in our country, and supposedly one of the preeminent intellectuals in our country, arguing around issues in this form. Yet, I would argue that what the EFF has done, and done brilliantly, they have critiqued the neoliberal and right-wing macroeconomic policies of Treasury. So they have criticized, for example, Minister Malusi Gigaba, who was head of basically National Treasury. So they themselves have criticized Africans and undermined African leadership, and I think correctly so. And what Floyd has done is that hurt his party. He has embarrassed his party. He's got himself into a pickle because the EFF has led the charge, I think correctly so, in saying that the macroeconomic policies of South Africa post-1994 have not led to the alleviation of poverty and inequality, but actually deepened it. But But by using race now, he has deflected the issue and made a mess of it, and he's an embarrassment.
All right, Sociology Professor Ashwin Desai. Terry, let me get your response to part of the issues that Ashwin has raised.
I mean, I think Ashwin is also, with all due respect, deflecting from the main issue, which is what happened in these committees and in Parliament today and previously. And clearly to me, and I think to everybody who read the discussion or watched it again, there is great tension between South Africans of Indian descent and South Africans of African descent. I mean, it's very clear. And I think that if I think of the work that I do in South Africa, which is around diversity, it's one of those issues that comes up continually. There is tension between the different groupings in South Africa, and it would be very strange if there wasn't. We come out of an apartheid and a colonial past. There are going to be tensions. I think that because of Floyd being the person he is and having the reputation he has, everyone was only too quick to jump on the bandwagon and see this as a racial incident. And it's my belief that as South Africans, and especially as influential South Africans, professors at universities and political leaders, we should be very cautious about assuming things are racially based, because I think it just serves to inflame the racial tensions that already exist in South Africa. Floyd's question was around whether this undermines African leadership. And if we turn it on its head, Cathy, and say, let's look at it as if it were a gender issue, supposing 80% of the people who work in Treasury are women, and the one person that represents multiple committees is a man, well, women might be quite justified in standing up and saying, how can this happen? And I think that Floyd represents many African people in his view, that African leadership should be foregrounded. And one cannot deny that there is a need for this, which is not to say that Momoniat is not doing a good job. But one can understand that one needs to see, if there are a majority of African people, we need to see more of them. They are the leaders of this country.
All right. Thank you for your insights. Terry Oakley Smith, she's a diversity expert, and of course earlier Sociology Professor Ashwin Desai joining us from our Durban studio. Thank you to all our guests for helping us move this conversation a little bit further. Certainly a lot more work and understanding still needs to go into the conversations we have about race in this country. That's why we leave it for now. Join us again on Monday at 8 p.m. for another edition of As It Happens. Have yourselves a lovely evening.